Montana Territory, October 1874. 3 ravens were circling a freight wagon on the Clark Fork Road. The wagon had no team, no driver, and one rear wheel buried to the hub in frozen mud. Silas Harrow would have ridden past it, except something under the canvas was knocking. Not a fist, a heel, a very small heel striking wood from inside a willow basket. Silas dismounted with his rifle in one hand and pulled the canvas back with the other. The wagon bed had been stripped of anything worth selling. A flour sack had burst across the boards. One woman's glove lay near the tailgate. There was dried blood on the iron step, but no body in the road, no tracks he could read after 2 nights of wind, and beneath the driver's bench, wrapped in a buffalo robe, was a baby girl. She was blue around the mouth. Her cry had gone beyond crying. It was only a thin scrape of breath, as if she had already learned that noise did not always bring help. Pinned to the robe was a square of paper folded twice. The rain had blurred the pencil, but 4 words remained: "Please keep her safe." Silas read them once, then again. There was no name, no date, no explanation. Just a dying request addressed to whoever proved human enough to stop. Silas Harrow was 39 years old. He lived 11 miles above Black Pine Station in a 1-room cabin he had built beside a spring no map bothered to name. He spoke when trade required it, nodded when it did not, and had gone so long without company that the sound of his own voice sometimes startled him. He was not the child's father. He was not anyone's father. He had no wife, no family within 1,000 miles, and no sensible reason to carry a half-frozen infant into country where the first real snow could close the trail for 5 months. A sensible man would take her down to the county agent in Missoula. A sensible man would put the matter into official hands. Silas had trusted official hands once. When he was 14, a fever took his mother and left him with a little sister named Ada. The county separated them because the boys' ward had room and the girls' ward did not. By the time Silas found where they had sent her, Ada had been buried 3 weeks in a grave marked only by a number. He had spent 25 years telling himself there had been nothing he could have done. Standing beside that empty wagon, he knew he was about to find out whether he believed it. He took off his wool coat, tucked the baby against his shirt, and buttoned the coat around both of them. The scraping cry stopped, not because she was safe, because she had found heat. Silas looked north toward his cabin, then south toward the station. The south road was shorter. He turned north. He brought the buffalo robe, the note, and the woman's glove. He searched the ditch and the cottonwoods until the light went gray, calling out though he had no idea who he was calling for. Nothing answered except the river and the wind, so he mounted with one hand, held the child beneath his coat with the other, and rode into the mountains before the snow could erase the road completely. By midnight, Silas understood that courage and knowledge were not the same thing. He had enough of the first to bring a baby home. He had none of the second to keep one alive. The child would not drink from a cup. She could not hold her head. She shook even beside the stove, and every few minutes her breath seemed to disappear so long that Silas leaned close in terror, waiting for it to return. He owned 1 milk goat because canned milk cost money and coffee without milk tasted like boiled rope. He warmed the goat's milk, thinned it, and fed it through a strip of clean linen twisted into a point. 1 drop, then another, then another. He sat on the floor all night with the baby against his chest and talked to her because silence felt too much like surrender. He told her where the snow stacked deepest. He told her the stove smoked when the wind came east. He told her the mule named Joseph bit strangers but had never bitten him. He told her that Black Pine Spring never froze, even when the creek did. And sometime before dawn, without planning to, he told her about Ada. At sunrise, the baby opened her eyes. They were dark and unfocused but alive. Silas named her Grace. Not because he felt graceful, because nothing else explained why she was breathing. The first winter changed the shape of the cabin. Silas built a cradle from willow ribs and rawhide because he knew how to make snowshoes and decided a cradle was only a snowshoe with sides. The first one leaned, the second one pinched, the third held. He cut old shirts into gowns. He learned that a child could be dry, fed, warm, and still furious for reasons beyond the reach of reason. He learned that sleep came in pieces. He learned to work one-handed. He learned to recognize fever by the smell of her skin. Above the cradle he hung a small sun he cut from the copper reflector of a broken lantern. It was rough around the points and no bigger than his palm. When the stove flame moved, the little sun threw light across the ceiling. Grace watched it before she could turn her head. She reached for it before she could sit. By January, the pass was closed under 6 feet of snow. Silas and the child were alone for 103 days. They should have been the hardest days of his life. They were the first days he ever remembered wanting more of. Silas had mistaken the absence of pain for peace. Grace taught him the difference. Peace was not an empty cabin where nobody could leave you. Peace was a small hand closing around one finger in the dark. When the road opened in April, Silas carried Grace down to Black Pine Station in a cradleboard lined with rabbit fur. The station keepers stared, the teamsters stared. A woman pumping water dropped the handle and let the bucket overflow. Silas told the story once. He did not improve it. He showed them the note and the glove. He told them where the wagon stood. He told them he had found no body. A traveling sister from St. Agnes Mission examined Grace and said the child had survived more cold than most grown men could bear. She asked what Silas intended to do. "Raise her," he said. The sister looked at the cabin man, the beard, the rifle, the child chewing his coat button. Alone, Silas glanced down at Grace. Not anymore. The sister was named Beatrice. She insisted on writing down the finding in the mission register. Silas could sign his name, but he disliked paper and trusted it less than weather. Sister Beatrice made him stand beside the desk while she wrote the date, the place, the abandoned wagon, and the 4 words from the note. Then she added one line that meant nothing to him at the time. Grace Harrow, brought by Silas Harrow, resident at Black Pine Spring. She pressed the original note flat, slipped it into a paper envelope, and sealed it inside the back cover of the register. "For the day somebody comes asking," she said. Nobody came. Years did. Grace grew up at the head of Black Pine Creek, where the winters were long enough to teach patience and the summers too short to waste. At 4, she could tell mule tracks from elk. At 6, she could split kindling without burying the hatchet in the block. At 7, she could read because Silas traded 2 beaver pelts for a primer, and then learned the harder words beside her, pretending he already knew them. At 9, she could reckon a feed bill faster than the station keeper. At 11, she could set a broken chicken wing, clean a rifle, bake bread, and argue with her father until silence surrendered. Silas never hid the truth of her beginning. When she was old enough to ask why no mother lived in the cabin, he told her about the wagon. When she was old enough to understand loss, he told her he was not her blood father. When she was old enough to fear what that meant, he put the 4 words in front of her and said, "Blood did not bring you up this mountain. A choice did. I made it once. I have made it every day since." Grace kept a careful copy of the note in the family Bible after Sister Beatrice sent it to her on her 10th birthday. She never asked Silas whether he regretted stopping. She had lived beside him too long to insult him with the question. For 12 years, the cabin expanded around them, a 2nd room, a smokehouse, a barn, 3 fenced acres of hay meadow, a spring house built of stone so cold that butter stayed hard in July. Silas called it work. Grace called it home. Then the railroad surveyors came through the valley, and men who had ignored Black Pine Creek began measuring what it could be worth. Harlan Voss was one of them. Voss owned a timber contract big enough to keep 2 sawmills running. He needed water to float cut logs down from the upper slopes, and Black Pine Spring was the only steady source above the dry valley. If he controlled the spring and the narrow creek below it, he could move timber all summer instead of waiting for the snowmelt. He first offered Silas $800. Silas said no. The next year, Voss offered $1,200. Silas said no again. The 3rd year, he sent a lawyer with a map. Silas folded the map, handed it back, and said, "You drew your lines around my house." Voss stopped offering. In the spring of 1886, federal survey stakes appeared along the ridge. By August, Voss had filed an entry at the district land office covering the spring, the meadow, and everything Silas had built. He rode up to the cabin with a deputy clerk, 2 timber foremen, and a paper carrying enough seals to frighten most men. Grace was 12. She stood beside the door with the copper sun turning in the light behind her. Voss remained in the saddle. "You've occupied unsurveyed land," he told Silas. "Occupation is not ownership. The township is open now, and I filed first." Silas took the paper and read slowly. He had learned more words because Grace had made ignorance inconvenient. "When do you want us gone?" he asked. "Before the heavy snow." Grace felt her father's hand close around the paper. Voss mistook the silence for defeat. He should not have. Silas looked past him toward the spring house, the barn, and the roof he had raised while a baby slept in a basket beneath it. "I carried my daughter into this cabin 12 years ago," he said. If paper says I was nowhere because I had not paid a clerk to notice me, then paper is lying, Voss smiled. Paper is what the law hears. Grace watched him right away, then she looked at the copper sun above the door. She had spent her life learning that small things could hold more than they appeared to. A note could hold a family. A line in a book could hold a date, and a date, she suspected, could hold land. That evening Silas said he would ride to the land office in Missoula and contest the entry. Grace asked what proof he would take. He pointed at the cabin. The house. They know the house is here now, she said. How do you prove when it began? Silas had no answer. Most of the men who had helped him raise the second room were dead or gone. No neighbor lived close enough to swear to every year. He had paid no property tax because the land had not been surveyed. He had kept no diary. His receipts had gone into the stove each winter. Voss had understood the weakness before he ever filed. Silas had 12 years of truth, and almost no paper. Grace lay awake after the lamp went out. She remembered Sister Beatrice's careful handwriting, resident at Black Pine Spring. She remembered the station freight book, where every sack of flour, every coil of rope, and every stove part had been signed for by whoever hauled it into the mountains. And she remembered a pamphlet wrapped around a bundle of nails the year before. It said that a prior settler who had occupied an improved public land could challenge a later entry if the settlement could be proved. The law did not require a man to have been noticed by everyone. It required him to have been there. Grace knew where the proof had been waiting, but Harlan Voss moved before she could reach it. 3 weeks later, on a moonless night, his timber crew climbed above Black Pine Spring with powder, picks, and a plan to cut a diversion trench. If the water ran toward Voss's logging chute instead of through Silas's meadow, the cabin could still stand. It would simply become useless. The men set a charge into the shale bank. One of them, a 19-year-old sawyer named Eli Baines, asked whether the blast could reach the house. The foreman told him the old squatter had been warned. That was not an answer. It was the kind of sentence men use when they want obedience to sound like innocence. The charge went off just after midnight. The mountain answered harder than they expected. A shelf of wet shale broke loose above the spring. Rock, mud, and timber came down together. The spring house vanished first. The wall of water hit the barn, tore one corner free, and drove the roof sideways into the cabin. Silas woke to a sound like the world splitting. He shoved Grace through the rear window 1 second before the main beam fell. It caught him across the hip and pinned him beneath the roof. The stove overturned. Fire ran across the floor where lamp oil had spilled. Grace came around the cabin barefoot in the mud. She could hear her father but could not see him through the smoke. "Stay out," Silas shouted. She went in. The beam across him was too heavy to lift. The flames had reached the wall. Grace crawled under the smoke, wrapped a wet blanket around Silas's head, and saw the iron logging jack beside the tools. Silas had taught her to use it the previous winter. Not because he expected her to pull him out of a burning house, because on a mountain, knowledge was never wasted. Grace set the jack beneath the beam. The base slipped. She reset it on a plank. She worked the handle. Once, twice. The beam rose half an inch. "Again," Silas said through his teeth. Grace pumped until her shoulders shook. The beam lifted enough for him to drag one leg free, but the other would not move. The wall above them cracked. Grace ran outside, threw a harness over Joseph the mule, and fastened a chain through the broken window around the beam. Joseph fought the smoke and the noise. Grace covered his eyes with her nightdress, took the lead rope, and spoke to him in the same low voice Silas had used on frightened animals her entire life. "One step, Joseph." The mule leaned, the chain tightened. One more. The beam moved. Grace went back through the window, caught her father under the arms, and pulled while the cabin filled with sparks. They reached the mud as the roof came down. The men on the ridge had already run, all but Eli Baines. He stood among the trees watching a 12-year-old girl drag her father away from a fire his crew had started. He dropped his shovel. By dawn he was riding toward Black Pine Station to confess. Grace had no cabin, no spring house, and a father whose hip was broken badly enough that one boot pointed the wrong direction. She also had no time to grieve. She built a travois from 2 lodgepole saplings, tied it behind Joseph, and got Silas down the mountain through freezing rain. At the station, the keeper sent for a doctor. While the doctor cut away Silas's trousers and set the hip as straight as he could, Grace washed the mud from her feet, put on a borrowed dress, and asked for a horse. The station keeper said, "Where are you going, St. Agnes? Your father needs you. He needs the register more." She rode 22 miles before dark. Sister Beatrice had gone east years earlier, but the mission register remained in a locked cabinet beneath the chapel. The new priest found the entry. October 19, 1874. Grace Harrow, brought by Silas Harrow, resident at Black Pine Spring. Behind the cover was the envelope. Inside was the note, "Please keep her safe." The priest read the entry twice. Then he rang the chapel bell and called 2 witnesses from the kitchen. He copied the page, sealed it, and signed across the seal. Grace did not stop there. On the ride back, she went to Black Pine Station and opened the old freight books with the keeper beside her. There it was again, November 1874. One length of stovepipe delivered to Silas Harrow, Black Pine Spring. March 1875, 20 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of salt, 1 packet of infant medicine, same destination. Year after year the entries continued. Roof nails, window glass, a plow blade, school slates, a second bedstead. The books did not tell the story of a home. They proved one had existed. By the time the district hearing opened, Grace had more than a memory. She had a chain of years. The hearing was held in the schoolroom because the land office could not hold the crowd. Voss arrived with his attorney, his filed entry, and the confidence of a man accustomed to confusing money with inevitability. Silas arrived on a door laid across 2 sawhorses because he could not sit upright. Grace walked beside him carrying the mission copy, the freight ledgers, and the original note. Eli Baines sat near the back under the eye of the sheriff. The land examiner began with the filing. Voss's attorney argued that Silas was an unregistered occupant on newly surveyed land. He said the timber contract would bring wages, roads, and commerce. He said sentiment could not be allowed to obstruct legal development. Grace listened until he used the word sentiment for the 3rd time. Then she understood his whole defense. He wanted the room to believe that a home was only a feeling, while his paper was a fact. The examiner called Silas first. Silas told the truth. He had settled beside Black Pine Spring in 1873. He had not filed because the township had not been surveyed and because every spare dollar had gone into surviving winter and raising a child. He had built the cabin, fenced the meadow, dug the spring house, cut hay, and lived there openly. "Can you prove the date of continuous residence?" the examiner asked. Silas looked at Grace. "My daughter can." A murmur went through the room. Grace stepped forward. She was 12 years old, small for her age, wearing a borrowed brown dress with smoke damage still visible in her hair. She placed the mission copy on the desk. "This was written in October 1874, she said. "It names my father as a resident at Black Pine Spring. It was written because he carried me out of an abandoned wagon and brought me there." She placed the note beside it. "This is why the entry was made." Then she opened the first freight ledger. This records stovepipe delivered to the same place 3 weeks later. She opened another. This records infant medicine the following spring, then another. These continue for 12 years. The room became very quiet. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mr. Voss says my father was nowhere until a clerk drew the township lines. These books say otherwise. The mission says otherwise. The house he burned says otherwise." Voss's attorney stood so fast his chair fell backward. The examiner struck the desk. Before the argument could begin, the sheriff brought Eli Baines forward. Eli's face had gone gray. He testified that Voss's foreman ordered the diversion blast after Silas refused to leave. He testified that the crew knew the blast could destroy the spring and make the claim unlivable. He testified that when the slide hit the cabin, the foreman ordered the men to ride. "Did Mr. Voss give that order himself?" the attorney demanded. Eli looked at Voss. He said he did not care how the water changed direction, only that it changed before the hearing. Voss called him a liar. Eli began to shake. Then Grace reached into her pocket and set a small piece of copper on the desk. It was 1 point from the sun that had hung above her cradle. She had found it in the mud after the roof fell. "My father built a home before Mr. Voss knew the spring existed," she said. "He kept me alive there. I am not asking you to give us somebody else's land. I am asking you not to let a later paper erase 12 years because the man who lived them was too poor to pay for better paper." That was the line the room remembered. The examiner did not decide from pity. He decided from proof. The mission register established residence in 1874. The freight ledgers established continued occupation and improvement. The surviving fences, meadow, barn foundation, and springhouse stones established labor on the land. The later filing could not outrank a prior settler whose claim had begun before the survey and whose occupation could be documented. Voss's entry was suspended. Silas was given the right to complete his own filing. There was still a fee. Silas did not have it. The station keeper opened a freight account in his own name and passed a subscription sheet down the valley. No speech announced it. The blacksmith signed for $2. A widow promised 50 cents and wrote beside it that Silas had once repaired her roof in a storm without charging. Teamsters pledged part of their next haul. The mission covered the final balance. Even Eli Baines, awaiting trial for his part in the blast, signed over the $5 he had in his boot. The fee was paid before the week ended. Silas Harrow received title to 160 acres surrounding Black Pine Spring. The paper carried his name, but everyone in the valley knew Grace had earned the ink. Harlan Voss was never convicted of ordering the blast. Men like him were careful to leave commands unfinished. He lost something more useful than a courtroom argument. He lost men willing to obey him. The Sawyers quit. The station refused his freight. Ranchers denied his cruise water. The railroad canceled his contract after the land dispute reached Helena. Within 18 months, Voss sold the mill and left the territory. Silas rebuilt on the same stone foundation. His hip healed crooked. He walked with a cane and could no longer climb the upper ridge, so Grace climbed it for him and described the weather when she returned. The spring ran clear again by summer. Grace placed the bent copper sun above the new door. One point was missing. Silas said that made it honest. Years passed. At 17, Grace went to Helena and apprenticed in a lawyer's office where homestead claims were copied, witnessed, and filed. She returned to the valley as a document writer, helping isolated families put their years on paper before somebody richer tried to erase them. She married a quiet wheelwright named Thomas Reed, a man who listened before speaking and never once treated her knowledge like a performance arranged for his benefit. They built a larger house beside Silas's cabin. Then children came. The mountain that had once held one man who preferred silence held supper arguments, wet boots, schoolbooks, babies, and doors that never stayed shut. Silas complained about the noise. He also built every cradle. He lived to 81. On his last morning, Grace sat beside him while snow moved softly past the window. The copper sun turned above the door, worn bright by his thumb, her fingers in the hands of children who knew it only as part of the house. Silas looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Grace. "I was supposed to keep you safe," he said. Grace took his hand. "You did." He shook his head. "No, we took turns." Those were his last words. They buried him above Black Pine Spring, beneath the firs where he could hear the water in every season. Grace chose the words for the marker. She did not carve the note. That request belonged to the frightened stranger who had written it. She carved the answer. He did, all his life.